Before colonial rule, India commanded roughly 20% of the global GDP. By 1947, a country historically defined by its wealth was struggling with mass starvation. Look at how trade inverted to create that reality. On the left, we see the pre-colonial structure. India exported high-value manufactured goods, like fine cotton and spices, in exchange for gold and silver. On the right is the 1947 structure. India was stripped down to exporting cheap raw cotton and importing finished factory-made shirts. This reversal repositioned India as a feeder economy. By shifting the flow of goods, the administration secured a consistent source of raw materials to supply Britain's expanding industrial base. This flowchart maps out colonial exploitation, the core theme for this CBSE topic. To prove how the British achieved this, we have to analyze their policies across 5 distinct pillars: agriculture, industry, trade, demographics, and infrastructure. The widespread poverty recorded in 1947 was the calculated output of this colonial algorithm. We start with agriculture. Look at this photograph of a farmer using a wooden plow and oxen. At the time, 85% of India's population lived in villages and relied entirely on farming. Despite this massive labor force, agricultural productivity was extraordinarily low. The primary cause of that low productivity is mapped in this 3-tier pyramid. This represents the Zamindari, or land settlement system. The British sat at the absolute top. Zamindars occupied the middle tier, and the actual cultivators formed the wide base. The British required Zamindars to pay a fixed revenue sum called lagan. To secure their own profits on top of that strict quota, Zamindars aggressively extracted the maximum possible rent from the cultivators. By the time the rent was paid, cultivators were left with barely enough food to survive and zero surplus capital. Without capital, they were incapable of investing in basic irrigation, better seeds, or modern technology. The Zamindari system engineered agricultural collapse because it eliminated the financial incentive to innovate. If landlords seize all the extra yield, cultivators have no reason to try and increase production. Moving to the industrial sector, the objective was systematic de-industrialization. This photo shows the long, mechanized rows of a British textile mill. The British needed a captive market for these factory goods, which meant domestic Indian industries had to be dismantled. They used the discriminatory tariff policy to achieve this. Look at the first half of this equation. The British permitted the completely tax-free export of Indian raw materials and the tax-free import of British factory goods back into India. Now look at the second half. Any finished Indian handicrafts intended for global markets were hit with a heavy export tariff. This made Indian goods artificially expensive and destroyed their international competitiveness. Let's apply active recall here. In 1850, the British introduced the railways. Think about how this specific infrastructure update worsened the crisis for local artisans. Railways bypassed the geographical barriers of the vast Indian subcontinent. This allowed cheap, machine-made British goods to flood deep into remote villages, ultimately destroying the last remaining domestic markets for local craftsmen. This brings us to a paradox regarding trade. Look at this photograph of the Calcutta harbor. Notice the immense concentration of commercial sailing ships. India consistently generated a massive export surplus, but that trade volume never generated domestic wealth. That surplus was erased by the drain of wealth. The revenue generated by exports was siphoned off to pay for British colonial administration offices and to fund overseas wars. None of it was invested back into the Indian economy. By weaponizing both tariffs and infrastructure, the administration guaranteed Indian reliance on imported British goods while actively draining its capital reserves. We can measure the human cost of the system by examining the demographics. We mark 1921 as the year of the Great Divide. This was the year India's population began to grow continuously, stepping into the second stage of demographic transition. As this data shows, the educational devastation was severe. Overall literacy across the country was below 16%, and female literacy was roughly 7%. Look at the public health metrics. Life expectancy was just 32 years. The infant mortality rate stood at 218 deaths for every 1,000 live births. These statistics are the biological receipt of a colonial system that optimized for wealth extraction while intentionally ignoring public health and social infrastructure. Let's organize this data so you can use it effectively in your exams. For 6-mark CBSE questions, use the PID framework: policy, impact, and data. Here is how that works for the agricultural sector. First, state the policy, the Zamindari system. Second, explain the impact. It extracted all cultivator surplus and disincentivized investment. Third, anchor it with data. 85% of the population depended on farming. This mind map summarizes the entire topic. You can see the 5 major branches extending outward: agriculture, industry, trade, demographics, and infrastructure. Each branch contains the specific British policies and the corresponding exam data we just covered. Take a screenshot of this diagram. Keep it as your structural baseline when you practice outlining your essay answers. Board examiners look for a logical reconstruction of how these specific policies resulted in economic exploitation, supported by the data points we have reviewed.